Welcome back. For more than 2 decades, the murder of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor, has remained one of the most controversial and closely watched criminal cases in America. Her husband, Scott Peterson, was convicted of their murders. To millions of people, the case was settled. The verdict was clear. The story was over. But was it? Years later, questions surrounding the investigation have refused to disappear. Disputed evidence, alternative theories, and renewed efforts to examine the case have brought Scott Peterson's conviction back into the national spotlight. Now, with new attention focused on the evidence, one question is being asked again. Did the investigation uncover the complete truth? Or is there still something we don't know? In this documentary, we will go back to the beginning. We will examine Laci's disappearance, the investigation that turned her husband into America's most infamous suspect, the evidence that led to his conviction, and the questions that continue to surround the case today. This is the story of Scott Peterson and the evidence that could change how America sees one of its most unforgettable murder cases. Chapter 1. The Christmas Eve Disappearance, December 24th, 2002. Christmas Eve. Across Modesto, California, families were preparing for the holidays. Homes were decorated, gifts were wrapped, and Christmas was only hours away. But inside one home on Covenant Avenue, something was about to happen that would capture the attention of an entire nation. 27-year-old Laci Peterson was 8 months pregnant. She and her husband, Scott Peterson, were expecting their first child, a baby boy they had already named Connor. To the people around her, Laci appeared excited about becoming a mother. Christmas was approaching, and the birth of her son was only weeks away. But on the morning of December the 24th, Laci disappeared. According to Scott Peterson, he left their home that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles away. Scott said that when he left, Laci was at home. Later that day, he returned, but Laci was nowhere to be found. Her car was still there. Her personal belongings remained behind, and as the hours passed, what may have initially seemed like a delay or misunderstanding quickly became something far more serious. Laci's family and friends began searching. Police were contacted, neighbors were questioned, and soon the quiet streets around the Peterson home were filled with people looking for any sign of the missing woman. The timing made the disappearance especially alarming. Laci was heavily pregnant. It was Christmas Eve, and according to those closest to her, simply vanishing without contacting anyone was completely out of character. The search quickly expanded. Volunteers distributed flyers. News organizations began reporting the story. Laci's photograph appeared across television screens. A young, pregnant woman had disappeared just before Christmas, and America wanted to know where she was. At first, Scott Peterson appeared publicly as the husband of a missing woman, but investigators were already doing what they do in almost every disappearance. They were reconstructing the final hours. Who saw Laci last? Where had she been? Who had spoken to her? And what exactly happened inside the Peterson home before Scott left for his fishing trip? Scott told investigators that his plan that morning had changed. He had considered playing golf, but instead decided to take his boat out onto San Francisco Bay. His destination was the Berkeley Marina. That detail would later become one of the most important facts in the entire case. because investigators needed to establish a timeline. Scott had traveled a considerable distance from Modesto to the marina. Meanwhile, Laci had disappeared from home. But there was another problem. There was no obvious crime scene, no clear eyewitness to a murder, and no immediate physical evidence explaining what had happened to her. At this stage, Laci was still officially a missing person. Her family held on to hope. The community continued searching, but behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to look more closely at Scott, not simply because he was her husband, but because every detail of his timeline had to be tested. Where did he go? When did he leave? When did he return? And could his story be independently verified? Then investigators discovered something that would completely change the direction of the case. Scott Peterson had been living a secret life. Weeks before Laci disappeared, he had begun a relationship with another woman. Her name was Amber Fry, and when Amber eventually learned that the man she knew as Scott Peterson was connected to the disappearance of a pregnant woman, she contacted the police. What she told investigators was extraordinary. According to Amber, Scott had told her before Laci disappeared that he had lost his wife and that the upcoming holiday season would be his first Christmas without her. But on the day Scott allegedly made that statement, Laci Peterson was still alive. For investigators, this raised a disturbing question. Why would a man describe himself as having lost his wife before she had even disappeared? From that moment, the case began to change. Scott Peterson was no longer simply the husband of a missing woman. He was becoming the central focus of one of the most closely watched investigations in America. But suspicion is not evidence, and despite the growing public attention, one enormous question remained unanswered. Where was Laci Peterson? The answer would not come for months, and when it finally did, the location would transform this missing person investigation into a murder case and place Scott Peterson at the center of a legal battle that continues to generate questions more than 2 decades later. But before investigators could build their case, they first had to understand the man behind the headlines and the secrets he had been keeping. Chapter 2: The Secret Life of Scott Peterson. As investigators searched for answers in Laci Peterson's disappearance, they began looking deeper into the life of the man closest to her husband, Scott Peterson. At first, Scott appeared to many people as a grieving husband, desperate to find his missing wife. He spoke to the media. He participated in searches. He publicly asked for Laci's safe return. But behind that public image, investigators discovered a hidden part of Scott's life, a secret relationship. Before Laci disappeared, Scott Peterson had met a woman named Amber Fry. Amber was a massage therapist and a single mother living in Fresno, California. According to Amber, Scott introduced himself as an unmarried man. He told her he had never been married and gave the impression that he was starting a new chapter in his life. The two began a romantic relationship in November 2002, but there was one major fact Amber did not know. Scott Peterson was already married, and his wife, Laci, was 8 months pregnant. When Amber later learned that Scott was actually a married man whose pregnant wife was missing, she contacted authorities. For investigators, this was a major development, not because having an affair proved someone committed a crime. It did not, but because Scott's relationship with Amber raised serious questions about his honesty and his actions before Laci's disappearance. Investigators wanted to understand, why did Scott hide his marriage? Why did he tell Amber a different story about his life? And why did some of his statements appear to conflict with the timeline of Laci's disappearance? Soon, Amber began cooperating with police. Her phone conversations with Scott became an important part of the investigation. During these conversations, investigators listened carefully, not only to what Scott said, but also to how his story changed over time. One of the most disturbing moments came when Scott spoke about the holiday season and described a future without his wife. At the time, Laci was still missing. For investigators, these statements became another piece of a much larger puzzle. Meanwhile, public opinion began shifting. The media coverage surrounding the case grew rapidly. Every detail of Scott's personal life was being examined. The discovery of the affair changed the way many people viewed him. A husband who was once seen as a desperate man searching for his missing wife was now being questioned by the public and investigators. But suspicion alone was not enough. Police still needed evidence. They needed to prove what happened to Laci. They needed to connect Scott's actions to her disappearance. And most importantly, they needed answers. As the investigation continued, detectives started focusing more closely on Scott's movements on the morning Laci vanished, his decision to go fishing, his location, his timeline, and the strange details surrounding his boat. Because investigators believed the answer to Laci Peterson's disappearance might not be found only in Scott's personal life. It might be hidden in the events of December 24th, 2002, the day Laci disappeared. And as police continued searching for the missing mother-to-be, a new question began to dominate the investigation. Was Scott Peterson simply a man hiding an affair? Or was there something much darker behind his actions? Chapter 3. The investigation that changed everything. As the days passed, the search for Laci Peterson became one of the largest missing person investigations in California. Thousands of volunteers joined the search. Posters with Laci's face appeared throughout the community. Her family refused to give up hope. They believed that somewhere, somehow, Laci and her unborn son Connor could still be found. But for investigators, every hour that passed created more questions. A missing pregnant woman, a husband with a changing public image, and a timeline that needed to be examined carefully. Detectives began reconstructing Scott Peterson's movements on December the 24th, the day Laci disappeared. Scott told investigators that he had left their Modesto home to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. At first, the trip appeared to be a simple detail, but investigators quickly realized that this decision would become one of the most important parts of the case. Why would Scott travel so far away on the morning his pregnant wife was missing? What exactly happened during the hours when he was away? And was there anything at the marina that could provide answers? Police searched the Peterson home. They examined vehicles. They collected evidence. They studied phone records and timelines. Every small detail became important. Then investigators discovered another piece of information. Scott owned a small fishing boat. He had purchased it shortly before Laci disappeared. According to Scott, he had planned to use the boat for fishing at the Berkeley Marina that day. But investigators began asking a critical question. Why did Scott choose to go fishing on that specific day? The attention on Scott grew stronger. The public was following every development. News cameras surrounded the Peterson home. And as the investigation continued, Scott's behavior and statements were examined more closely than ever. Meanwhile, search teams continued looking for Laci. The case had become a national story. People across America wanted answers. But for Laci's family, this was not a television story. This was a daughter, a wife, a mother who was about to welcome her first child. Nearly 4 months after Laci disappeared, a discovery near the San Francisco Bay changed everything. On April 13th, 2003, a person walking near the shoreline discovered human remains. The next day, another discovery was made nearby. The remains were identified as Laci Peterson. Shortly afterward, the remains of her unborn son, Connor, were also found. The search for a missing woman had become a murder investigation. For investigators, this was the moment the case entered a new phase. They were no longer searching for what happened. They were now building a case to prove who was responsible. The evidence surrounding the location of the remains, Scott's timeline, his statements, and his actions after Laci disappeared would all become central issues. But finding Laci did not answer every question. Instead, it created even more. How did she end up there? When did she die? And what evidence could connect Scott Peterson to the crime? The investigation had reached its most important stage, and now prosecutors would begin putting together the case that would eventually decide Scott Peterson's fate. A case built on evidence, testimony, and a story that would divide America. Chapter 4: The Trial of Scott Peterson. After the discovery of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor, the investigation moved into a new and more intense phase. For authorities, the question was no longer whether a crime had occurred. The question was, who was responsible? By this point, Scott Peterson had become the main suspect. Investigators believed that the evidence surrounding Laci's disappearance, Scott's behavior, and his changing statements pointed toward him. On April 18th, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested in California. At the time of his arrest, he was found in San Diego. He had changed his appearance, carried multiple forms of identification, and had a large amount of cash with him. Prosecutors argued that these details suggested he was trying to avoid being found. Scott's defense team, however, offered a different interpretation. They argued that the circumstances were being misunderstood and that suspicion was not the same as proof. The case officially moved toward trial, and when the trial began in 2004, it quickly became one of the most watched criminal cases in American history. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They argued that Scott Peterson had killed Laci because he wanted to escape his marriage and continue his relationship with Amber Frey. They presented evidence about his affair. They questioned his timeline. They focused on his statements after Laci disappeared. They also presented forensic evidence and testimony from experts. One of the most important parts of the prosecution's case involved Scott's boat. Prosecutors argued that the boat was connected to the crime and that Scott's explanation of his fishing trip raised serious questions. But the defense challenged many parts of the prosecution's argument. They argued that there was no direct eyewitness to the crime. They questioned the reliability of certain evidence, and they suggested that investigators focused too heavily on Scott while failing to fully explore other possibilities. Throughout the trial, Amber Frey became one of the most important witnesses. Her recorded conversations with Scott were played in court. The jury heard conversations where Scott appeared to maintain a false story about his personal life. For prosecutors, these recordings showed deception. For the defense, they did not prove murder. The trial lasted several months. Every piece of evidence was examined. Every statement was questioned. And millions of people across America followed the courtroom battle. On November 12, 2004, after nearly 7 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Scott Peterson was found guilty of the murders of Laci Peterson and Connor Peterson. The courtroom reaction was intense. For Laci's family, the verdict represented a moment of justice. For Scott Peterson, it meant a life sentence that would later become one of the most debated punishments in the American legal system. But even after the conviction, the story was not over, because years later, questions about the investigation, the evidence, and the trial would continue. Some people believed the case was solved. Others continued to question whether every detail had been fully explained. And that debate would follow Scott Peterson for decades. Chapter 5. The questions that remain. The verdict had been delivered. Scott Peterson had been convicted of murdering his wife, Laci Peterson, and their unborn son, Connor. For many people, the case was finally closed. But in the years that followed, the story continued. After his conviction, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death. However, in 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, ruling that errors occurred during jury selection. His murder conviction was not overturned. The court's decision meant that while the conviction remained, Peterson would receive a new sentencing hearing. Eventually, his sentence was changed from death row to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the legal battles did not end there. Over the years, Scott Peterson and his legal team continued to challenge aspects of the case. They questioned parts of the investigation, the trial process, and the evidence presented against him. Meanwhile, public interest in the case never disappeared. New documentaries, interviews, and renewed discussions brought the case back into the spotlight. Supporters of the conviction argue that the evidence clearly showed Scott Peterson was responsible. They point to his lies, his affair, his behavior after Laci disappeared, and the evidence presented during the trial. But others believe there are still unanswered questions. They argue that some parts of the investigation deserve further examination, and that is why, even more than 20 years later, the Scott Peterson case remains one of America's most debated true crime stories. Because beyond the headlines, the courtroom, and the media attention, there was a real family that lost someone they loved. Laci Peterson was not just a name in a criminal case. She was a daughter, a wife, and a mother whose life ended before she could meet her child. The story of Scott Peterson continues to raise difficult questions about evidence, justice, and the search for truth. A case that began with a missing woman on Christmas Eve became a national obsession, a courtroom battle, and a mystery that still captures America's attention today. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary interesting, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation. We bring you the stories behind the headlines, the cases that shock the world, and the questions that continue to remain. Until the next documentary, stay curious,